1759, the year the Montreval dynasty died, not with a war or a fire but with supper. Inside the marble-walled dining hall of Château de Montreval, 23 candles flickered against silver, their light trembling like breath over porcelain plates. The servants moved silently, trained to glide like shadows. The smell of freshly baked bread lingered in the air, soft and golden, the scent of comfort, of home. No one could have known it was also the scent of death. Hours later, that same hall was silent. Every member of the Montreval family lay lifeless at the table, mouths faintly blue, eyes fixed on nothing. Crumbs clung to their lips like evidence of a ritual no one had intended to perform. Historians would later label it the Montreval tragedy, a case of accidental poisoning caused by spoiled grain. But those who lived in the valley knew better, or at least believed they did. The villagers whispered that the bread was cursed, kneaded not by hands of service but by hands of vengeance. Some claimed it was the family's own baker, Lucien Morel, who infused grief into the dough after the unjust death of his daughter. Others said it was punishment from the saints, a divine act against a dynasty that had grown rich from famine. In the months before the tragedy, strange things had already begun to happen in Montreval. The ovens, usually steady and reliable, began to burn bread unevenly, as if the flames themselves were temperamental. The pigeons near the granary died suddenly, their bodies untouched by rot. The countess complained of hearing scratching beneath the floors, like mice made of stone. And yet the family continued to host lavish feasts, as if excess could drown out the whispers of decay. When investigators finally arrived, they found no trace of common poison. No arsenic, no mercury, no belladonna. Only a loaf of bread, half-eaten, its crust darkened like burnt bone. The priest who blessed that meal refused to speak afterward, muttering in confession that something watched us eat. His words were stricken from the parish record, replaced by a single line, Act of God. For centuries, the Château de Montreval stood abandoned. Ivy devoured its walls, rainwater carved veins through its marble floors. Travelers who dared to enter at night told stories of warm air rising from the kitchen, of a faint scent of yeast that grew stronger the deeper they ventured in. A few swore they heard the rhythmic sound of kneading, steady, patient, eternal. None stayed long enough to prove it. Even now the legend divides opinion. Some see tragedy, others see justice. Was it simple contamination? A case of ergot-laced rye, the same fungus that once drove entire villages to madness? Or was it something older, darker, crafted not by science but by sorrow? When rain falls in Burgundy, the villagers still close their windows. They say the wind carries the scent of the last bread ever baked in Montreval, warm, bitter, and impossible to forget. To understand the night of the poisoned bread, one must first understand the dynasty it destroyed. The Montrevals, a family whose wealth was built as much on sanctimony as sin. For 2 centuries they ruled their stretch of Burgundy like monarchs of a smaller kingdom, their crest etched into iron gates and silverware alike. Their vineyards stretched toward the horizon. Their mills fed 3 villages, and yet their legacy was nourished, not by generosity but by fear. The Montrevals were a paradox made flesh, elegant and cruel, devout and deceitful, revered and despised in equal measure. Father Etienne Montreval, the final patriarch, was a man of striking duality. By day, he was the benefactor of the parish, the patron of the arts, the man who funded schools for the poor and gilded the altar at Saint Clément's chapel. By night, he was rumored to rage behind closed doors, his temper sharp as broken glass. His wife, Geneviève, the Countess of Montreval, embodied quiet grace, pale, poised, and famously mute during public appearances. It was said she had once been a singer of extraordinary talent, but after her marriage her voice was heard only in the chapel, and even then, rarely. Their union was one of appearance, not affection, a performance staged for the lineage they both served. Servants who worked in the chateau described a house ruled by precision and superstition. At dinner, no one spoke without permission. Servants stepped in patterns, clockwise when serving wine, counterclockwise when removing plates, because the count believed order kept misfortune away. And yet, within this strict geometry of wealth and ritual, small rebellions persisted. The kitchen, the heart of the estate, became a place of whispers. The baker, Lucien Morel, an aging man with calloused hands and eyes the color of burnt crust, was perhaps the only servant, permitted a hint of familiarity with the Montreval household. Bread was sacred to Etienne. He believed it symbolized purity, the body of providence as he called it. Thus, the baker who crafted it held a peculiar kind of power. Lucien had served the family faithfully for 20 years. He was meticulous, proud of his work, and fiercely protective of his daughter, Céline, who worked as a scullery maid. Those who knew him described a quiet man of few words, whose grief, when it finally came, burned cold. Céline's death was as sudden as it was strange. One day she was dismissed from the estate under accusations of theft, a missing brooch belonging to the Countess, and 2 weeks later, her body was found in the river that ran below the vineyards. The official record claimed suicide, but the villagers muttered otherwise. They said she had been seen fleeing the chateau at dusk, pursued by one of the guards. Some said her throat bore marks, though no autopsy was ever performed. After that day, Lucien stopped attending Mass. He shuttered his cottage near the mill and drearily spoke. When he did appear in town, his hands were covered in burns, though no one saw smoke from his chimney. And when he passed the churchyard, he no longer crossed himself. The priest, Father Adrien, visited him once and returned pale, refusing to discuss what was said. Whatever faith Lucien once had seemed to have been replaced by something else, something harder, quieter, more enduring. The first signs of unrest at Montreval appeared soon after. Bread began to taste faintly sour. The dough rose unevenly. The flour sacks, once pristine, showed strange gray discolorations along their seams. Pigeons near the granary were found dead, their stomachs bloated and their eyes cloudy white. When a few field hands fell ill after eating scraps, the doctor blamed damp grain. The priest called it divine warning. The count dismissed both, ordering the millers to grind faster and pray louder. But the unease had already taken root. The kitchens grew colder, despite the heat of the ovens. Servants reported a hum beneath the floor, not of machinery, but of something living. One maid claimed the bread sang while it baked. It's here that the story fractures, like a mirror struck from behind. Shawna version, the one told in official archives, claims that Lucien Morel, overcome by grief, returned to the chateau one final time, under the pretense of baking for the anniversary feast. He was said to have used grain from an infected harvest, rye contaminated by the black fungus ergot, known in later centuries to cause madness and death. This theory fit neatly into reason, allowing authorities to seal the case with scientific explanation. But there was another version, older, quieter, harder to dismiss. It claimed that Lucien never returned at all, that someone else entered the kitchens that night, someone cloaked, unseen, moving through the corridors like smoke, that the bread, once blessed and broken by Father Adrien, had been baked not by mortal hands but by the curse of a grieving father's silence. Records from the Dijon archives only deepen the confusion. Letters between the Montrevals and a Parisian alchemist speak of elixirs of vitality and tonics for preservation, fashionable experiments among the nobility. One letter, dated 6 months before the deaths, describes an attempt to bind youth to the flesh through sacramental ingestion. Another, written by the Countess herself, requests bread of longevity consecrated by both faith and fire. The phrasing is strange, theological, almost ritualistic. Historians have argued over its meaning for decades. Was the family experimenting with early chemistry, or had their fascination with purity and immortality crossed into occult territory? Meanwhile, accounts from villagers paint an entirely different picture. They speak of the Montreval fortune faltering. The vineyards had suffered blight. Debts were mounting. A shipment of grain bought cheaply from a northern monastery had arrived moldy, but rather than discard it, the count ordered it milled to save money. This grain, they claimed, was the same used for the final feast. If true, the cause was simple greed. But then why did no one else who ate the bread that week fall ill? The servants who sampled the same batch survived untouched. The poison, whatever it was, seemed selective, deliberate. One letter, long forgotten until unearthed by a 20th century historian, adds a chilling layer. Written by the Count's steward, Henri Dufour, it describes a visitor cloaked in ash who came to the kitchen door 3 days before the feast, claiming to bring a sacred grain for the anniversary blessing. The steward thought little of it. The stranger left quickly, vanishing into the fog. That letter was found among Dufour's belongings after his disappearance. He was last seen walking toward the granary at dusk. His lantern was discovered days later beside the riverbank, still lit. By the time investigators arrived after the tragedy, the scene defied explanation. The ovens were cold, yet a faint warmth lingered in there. The bread that remained was thick, dark, fragrant. Its crust burned in perfect symmetry. Every loaf looked identical, as if stamped by an unseen hand. Those who handled it reported a tingling sensation like static. The Doctor who examined the bodies noted no ordinary signs of poisoning, no swelling, no lesions, only a peculiar stiffness and faint black discoloration along the veins. He speculated a mineral reaction in the bloodstream, though to what mineral he could not say. The priest, Father Adrian, refused to bless the bodies. He insisted they be buried without sacrament, claiming their souls were already spoken for. He resigned his post weeks later and entered a monastery in the Alps, where he took a vow of silence until his death. In his final confession, recorded by another friar, he wrote, "I have seen bread rise without flame and crumble without touch. I have seen sin take shape and feed upon the living. Every generation since has tried to claim certainty where none exists. Rational minds cling to the theory of ergot, a natural toxin, a tragic coincidence. The spiritually inclined invoke divine punishment, a reckoning for a lineage built on suffering. The romantics craft tales of vengeance, imagining Lucien Morel slipping through the gates one last time, his grief transmuted into something holy and cruel. But all agree on one point. The bread itself became an object of fixation. It was not just food. It was faith, guilt, punishment, and desire made tangible. In the centuries that followed, samples of the bread were said to have been preserved. None survive today, though fragments occasionally surface in private collections, bits of darkened crust sealed in glass, their provenance uncertain. Scientists who tested one fragment in 1964 found traces of alkaloids unknown to modern catalogs. The report vanished before publication. The researcher, a chemist named Dr. Robert Chaillot, died the following winter in a fire that consumed his entire laboratory. And so the story refuses to settle. Every explanation opens another question. Did Lucien Morel, driven by despair, truly commit an act of heretical revenge? Or did he become the scapegoat for sins that were never his? Was the family's downfall the result of human cruelty or divine precision? The Château de Montreval stands as both evidence and warning. Its ruins a reminder that truth, like bread, can nourish or destroy depending on what is kneaded into it. Even now, the villagers of Burgundy tell the story in two voices, one of reason, one of faith. On stormy nights, they claim you can still hear the sound of mixing from beneath the earth, a slow, deliberate rhythm, as though someone, or something, is still preparing the next batch. And every year, when the harvest moon rises, a single loaf is left at the gates of the ruins. No one knows who leaves it. No one dares take it away. Perhaps it's just tradition, a gesture to keep the legend alive. Or perhaps it's something older, an unspoken agreement between the living and the dead, that some hungers are best left unfed. Whatever truth lies buried in the ashes of the Montrevals, it remains unfinished, incomplete. The ovens may be cold, but the air in Montreval Valley still carries the faintest scent of yeast, sweet, bitter, enduring, as though the past itself continues to rise. The feast itself was said to be magnificent, almost prophetic in its decadence. It was the anniversary of the Montreval dynasty's founding, an annual ritual that had survived revolutions, wars, and whispers of scandal. Each year, the family gathered to reenact their legacy, a supper of gratitude to their ancestors, a demonstration of wealth to the world, and a silent sermon to the servants who watched from the shadows. In 1759, it would become something else entirely. The invitations had gone out months in advance, each sealed with wax and the Montreval crest, a serpent devouring its own tail. Guests arrived from Dijon, Lyon, and Paris, their carriages gleaming under the pale burgundy moon. The chateau, newly refurbished after a lightning strike the previous winter, shone like a cathedral of indulgence. Marble floors glistened, chandeliers dripped with crystal, and the scent of roasted pheasant and sugared almonds hung in the air like perfume. For weeks, the servants had been preparing, baking, polishing, and rehearsing the choreography of the night. Nothing at Montreval happened by chance. Even the seating arrangements followed a geometry of power. Those nearest to the patriarch were the most loyal. Those farthest away, the most suspect. Father Etienne Montreval presided at the head of the table, his presence as commanding as the portrait that hung behind him, a painted image of his ancestor, the dynasty's founder, whose eyes seemed to follow each guest. Geneviève, the countess, sat to his right, wearing a gown the color of ashes, her expression unreadable. Their son Julien, freshly returned from Paris, had brought with him philosophers and poets, young men intoxicated by Enlightenment ideals and skeptical of faith. They mocked the priest behind closed doors, yet dutifully crossed themselves when the bread was blessed. That night the feast unfolded like a ceremony. Each course was announced by trumpet. Musicians played waltzes that blurred into hymns. The table glittered with gold-rimmed plates, and servants moved with balletic precision. It was said that even the air shimmered with candlelight, refracting through crystal goblets and silver cutlery, until the hall itself seemed to pulse with golden warmth. Wine flowed like confession, heavy, red, and sweet enough to make saints forget their vows. The bread, baked in small round loaves and carried in baskets of polished silver, was tobe served last, just before the toast to the ancestors. When the priest, Father Adrian, stepped forward to bless it, witnesses described a hush falling over the room so complete that one could hear the candles sputter. His hands trembled slightly as he raised the loaf and whispered the Latin prayer of consecration. He had performed the ritual dozens of times before, but that evening something in his tone wavered, an undercurrent of doubt, or perhaps dread. Some later claimed that the loaf bled warmth into his palms, as if alive. At that precise moment, a cold wind swept through the dining hall. The heavy curtains billowed, and half the candles along the table extinguished themselves. A servant named Clara, who would later be found in an asylum, insisted that she felt the air change, as though someone unseen had entered the room. The Count, annoyed, demanded the doors be closed, laughing it off as the breath of our ancestors come to share the meal. The guests laughed nervously, glasses clinking. Yet in the silence that followed, the faint hum of something unseen, perhaps the echo of the ovens, perhaps not, seemed to rise through the floor. The bread was passed, slice by slice, steam rising like incense. The first to eat was the Count himself, then the Countess, her lips brushing the crust as if in benediction. One by one the others followed, 23 souls partaking in what would become their final communion. The first sign that something was wrong came not with a scream, but with stillness. Conversation faltered. A guest at the far end of the table, a cousin from Marseille, paused mid-bite. His expression slack, then came a sound, a sharp gasp, followed by the clatter of silverware. The Countess coughed once, then again, her hand at her throat. A dark line appeared along her neck, pulsing faintly beneath the skin. Someone shouted for water, another for prayer. Within moments, the room dissolved into chaos. Chairs overturned, glasses shattered, and the musicians, uncertain whether it was performance or panic, stopped playing altogether. What followed has been described in dozens of conflicting testimonies, none entirely reliable. Some claimed the victims convulsed, their limbs stiffening like marionettes. Others swore they saw the afflicted stare upward, eyes wide and unseeing, as if watching something descend from the ceiling. A few, perhaps too few to dismiss, spoke of fire. One guest allegedly cried out that he saw the walls melt, as though the room itself were baking. And amid it all, the Countess's final words were said to be, "The bread remembers." Within an hour, 23 people were dead or dying. The survivors, mostly servants who had not yet eaten, dragged bodies into the corridor, weeping and crossing themselves. Father Adrian attempted to perform last rites but stopped halfway through, trembling so violently that he dropped his rosary. Those who lived long enough to speak described unbearable heat in their throats, followed by visions. Flames blooming from bread, faces in the dough, the faint scent of lavender and decay. One dying nobleman whispered that he saw Céline Morel, the baker's daughter, standing in the doorway, her hair white as flour, her eyes empty as glass. The doctor's report, written the next day in elegant clinical script, concluded that fungal contamination was to blame, likely ergot, a parasitic mold found in rye. It could induce convulsions, hallucinations, and death, yet even the doctor's assistant noted something odd. There were no traces of mold on the remaining loaves. Moreover, none of the servants who had eaten scraps suffered any symptoms. The poison, it seemed, was selective. Father Adrian offered a different explanation. In his testimony to the Bishop of Dijon, he described the incident not as poisoning but possession. "The bread was unholy," he wrote. "It spoke in silence and fed upon sin." The church dismissed his account as hysteria, but rumors spread quickly. Within weeks, he was accused of heresy for suggesting that the body of Christ could be corrupted, that sacred ritual could invite damnation rather than grace. Before his trial could proceed, both he and the doctor vanished. Their carriages were found abandoned on opposite sides of the valley. Their bodies were never recovered. Clara, the servant who had seen the candles die, fared no better. After the investigation, she was sent to the Saint-Lazare Asylum in Paris. Nurses reported that she refused food, insisting that the bread remembers the hands that make it. The phrase became her obsession. She carved it into walls, scratched it into her skin, and repeated it until her voice cracked. When she died 3 years later, her cells smelled faintly of yeast. The tragedy at Montreval rippled through France like smoke, unseen but inescapable. Newspapers dubbed it Le Souper Maudit, the cursed supper. Scholars argued over the cause. Priests turned the event into a sermon. The estate was sealed by royal decree. Windows were boarded, the ovens dismantled, the silver melted down. Yet even in ruin, the chateau refused peace. Travelers who stayed near the valley claimed that on windless nights, they could hear the sound of kneading, slow, deliberate, rhythmic, as though someone were preparing dough in the dark. Superstition thrived. Farmers began refusing to grow rye. Bakers crossed themselves before opening their ovens. Children dared each other to whisper Montreval into flour sacks, believing the name would summon ghosts. But for the villagers who lived in the shadow of the estate, the fear was less theatrical. They spoke of a blight that returned each year, killing the wheat before harvest, of birds that refused to nest near the chateau, of a strange warmth that lingered in the soil where the ovens once stood, even in winter. Attempts to restore the estate were met with misfortune. In 1821, an architect from Paris purchased the land to build a hotel, hoping to capitalize on the legend. Within weeks, his workers fell ill. First nausea, then delirium, then madness. The project was abandoned. Decades later, a wealthy industrialist tried again, dreaming of a vineyard that would revive the Montreval name. He imported equipment, hired laborers, and laid new foundations over the ruins. 2 months later, a fire consumed the site. The cause was never determined. The industrialist's son swore he saw light flickering beneath the earth moments before the blaze began, as though the ovens had reopened. The curse, if one believes in such things, seemed cyclical. Every attempt to erase the past only fed it further. Priests were summoned to bless the ground. Scientists came to study the soil. One team claimed to detect organic compounds not native to the region, remnants of some fermentation process long extinct. Another found elevated temperatures 2 meters underground, as if embers smoldered beneath the surface. No rational conclusion held for long. Each explanation dissolved like dough collapsing in heat, and so the legend endured. The bread had not finished feeding. Over time, the story of the Montrevals evolved from tragedy to parable. To some, it was a warning against pride, the sin of believing that lineage could defy decay. To others, it was a meditation on grief, the way sorrow ferments when left unspoken. But among those who still lived in the valley, it was simply truth. The air itself seemed to remember. When rain fell, the scent of burnt crust rose from the earth. When thunder rolled, it echoed like kneading against wood. And sometimes, just before dawn, when mist gathered in the fields, one could almost see shapes moving. Figures bent over invisible tables, working dough that would never bake. Today, nothing remains of the dining hall but its foundations, swallowed by moss and silence. Yet archaeologists who have excavated the site report strange findings. Fragments of porcelain fused to stone, silver cutlery warped by heat, and beneath the floor, a layer of carbonized residue unlike any known ash. Some claim it is the remains of the bread itself. Others say it is simply soil, changed by centuries of rumor. But one artifact, found near what was once the kitchen, stands apart. A shard of pottery, inscribed with words so faint they required magnification to read. The inscription in a trembling hand reads, Pain qui prie, bread that prays. And perhaps that is the truest description of what happened that night. A meal meant to honor the past became a ritual that consumed the present. The Montrevals, in their quest to sanctify their legacy, may have created something beyond themselves, something that remembered. Whether by poison, blight, or curse, their feast became an act of communion reversed. The bread did not become the body of the divine. The divine, or something like it, devoured the body of man. The ovens of Montreval have long been cold, yet the story refuses to cool. It lingers in the collective imagination, half history, half haunting. And as long as it is told, the feast continues somewhere beyond reason, in that space between hunger and faith, where even the dead must eat. When scholars revisited the Montreval tragedy in the early 20th century, they did so not as believers, but as skeptics, armed with microscopes, cameras, and curiosity. What had once been whispered about in chapels and taverns was now dissected in laboratories and lecture halls. They sought to exhume truth from myth, to strip the supernatural from history. And yet the deeper they dug, the less certain they became that the two could ever be separated. The prevailing theory was scientific, ergotism. Known in medieval Europe as the devil's sickness, it was a disease caused by a fungus that infected rye grain. Symptoms included convulsions, hallucinations, and gangrene. Victims often screamed of fire consuming their flesh, of invisible hands twisting their limbs, accounts chillingly similar to what witnesses described at Montreval. Ergotism, scholars claimed, explained everything. The madness, the visions, even the blue tinge of the victim's lips. The bread had simply been tainted. No curse, no vengeance, just chemistry. For a time, that explanation satisfied most. It fit neatly within the narrative of progress, an age that prided itself on reason triumphing over superstition. Yet the illusion of certainty soon fractured. In 1927, a sealed chest was discovered in the catacombs beneath Dijon Cathedral. Inside were several artifacts believed to have been salvaged from the Montreval estate. Tarnished silverware, a rosary fused by heat, and most intriguingly, a small linen pouch labeled Restes du pain, remnants of bread. The fragments were brittle, dark, and almost glass-like. Samples were sent to laboratories in Paris, Vienna, and London for chemical analysis. The results were anything but conclusive. No trace of ergot was found, no fungal spores, no alkaloid residue. Instead, the test revealed traces of an unidentifiable plant compound, one that, when cross-referenced, bore resemblance to an extinct variety of Hyoscyamus niger, or henbane, a powerful hallucinogen used in ancient funerary rituals. The discovery divided the academic world. One scientist dismissed it as contamination from soil. Another argued it indicated deliberate inclusion. Could someone in 1759 have used the herb to induce visions? And if so, why? The debate intensified. In 1933, Professor Marcel Dufour of the University of Lyon published Toxins of Faith, proposing that the poisoning was intentional, not to kill, but to punish. According to Dufour, the Montreval's baker, Lucien Morel, might have replaced the rye with a concoction derived from local herbs traditionally used in peasant witchcraft. His aim, Dufour theorized, was to inflict divine retribution through madness rather than death. The bread was not poisoned to destroy, he wrote, but to reveal. The scandal his book created nearly cost him his career. Yet he never retracted the claim. Psychologists found in the story something equally tantalizing, a case study in collective guilt. The Montreval tragedy, they argued, could not be understood purely through chemistry. It was a symptom of social decay, a psychological reckoning disguised as divine punishment. For centuries, the Montrevals had ruled their valley through fear and famine. They had taxed their peasants into starvation, hoarded grain during droughts, and built chapels to atone for sins they never confessed. In that context, the curse seemed less a supernatural event than a moral inevitability. As one analyst put it, if bread sustains life, then poisoned bread is the language of vengeance. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, the tragedy became a mirror in which scholars projected their era's anxieties. Psychoanalysts compared the Montreval's downfall to mass neurosis, the aristocracy consumed by its own repressed guilt. Sociologists saw in it a parable of revolution, the slow fermentation of resentment that eventually bursts. Every generation interpreted the story through its own fears, reshaping it without ever resolving it. Religion predictably refused to yield. In 1894, decades before science laid its claim, a Jesuit historian named Father Antoine Rivoire had published Les Pains de la Damnation. In it, he argued that the bread of Montreval had been baked using holy water stolen from a baptismal font. To him, the poisoning was not physical but spiritual, the inevitable consequence of profaning the sacred for mortal pride. When the blessed becomes blasphemed, Rivoire wrote, it ceases to nourish and begins to devour. His thesis was dismissed by scientists but embraced by priests. Pilgrims began visiting the ruins to pray, not for the dead nobles but for the baker's soul. By the mid-20th century, Montreval was no longer a historical mystery but a cultural obsession. Each new explanation seemed to feed the legend rather than end it. Ergotism clashed with witchcraft. Guilt battled with grace. Faith confronted reason. The story became a circle with no center, each theory consuming the other like the serpent on the Montreval crest. Then came the explorers. In the 1960s, after decades of neglect, the chateau's ruins became a forbidden destination for thrill seekers, historians, and occult enthusiasts. The first documented expedition occurred in 1964, when 3 architecture students from Dijon broke through the estate's iron gates. Their journal, later published in fragments, described rooms preserved in eerie stasis. The dining hall remains intact, one entry read. Plates are still arranged as if waiting for guests. A loaf of bread, petrified but whole, sits at the head of the table. The students claimed the air inside was unnaturally warm, though the fireplace had long been sealed. 2 years later, a team of British parapsychologists arrived, funded by a small society dedicated to investigating residual hauntings. They brought with them electromagnetic sensors and reel-to-reel recorders. What they found, or believed they found, would rekindle the legend. One recording captured a faint rhythmic sound emanating from the lower kitchens. Thud, thud, pause, thud, like dough being kneaded. At precisely the same time, one of the researchers reported a sudden burning in his throat. The phenomenon ceased when they left the room. The tapes were later dismissed as mechanical interference, but copies circulated quietly among paranormal circles for decades. By the late 1970s, Montreval had become a pilgrimage for the curious. Photographers came seeking decay. Journalists came seeking a story, each left with something different, some with evidence, others with nightmares. One reporter from Le Monde described seeing faint handprints appear in the dust of the banquet table. A historian from Marseille swore he heard whispering in the oven room, though no one else was present. Every testimony added another layer to the myth. Then came the footage. In 1998, an anonymous video appeared online under the title Le Pain Maudit, the Baker's Return. Shot on a handheld camera, the footage showed a group of young explorers entering the ruins by candlelight. Their laughter echoed through the empty halls as they filmed the decayed grandeur. Collapsed ceilings, shattered mirrors, rusted chandeliers. The camera lingered on a long dining table covered in ash, and then, in the reflection of a broken mirror, something moved. It was fleeting, a blur shaped like a man in anapron bending forward as if kneading dough. The figure's arms moved in a slow, deliberate rhythm, though noon stood in that space. When the camera turned, the room was empty. Seconds later, the video cut to static. The footage went viral before viral even existed. Experts called it pareidolia, the human tendency to perceive familiar shapes in randomness. Skeptics insisted the image was a trick of light, or a double exposure. Yet those who had studied the Montreval case for years could not shake the unease. The motion, one historian noted, was not random. It was too precise, too human. Soon the debate moved online. Forums filled with theories. Scientific, spiritual, conspiratorial. Some users claim the footage proved the baker's spirit lingered, eternally recreating the moment of his crime. Others believed the figure represented not Lucien Morel, but the Count himself, condemned to repeat the feast as penance. And then there were those who proposed something far more disturbing, that the bread itself had achieved consciousness, that memory had imprinted on matter, and that what people saw was the embodiment of remembrance itself, grief, guilt, and hunger given form. The internet, for all its skepticism, gave the legend new life. Within months, amateur investigators were flocking to the site, uploading grainy videos of their own. Most showed nothing but crumbling stone and shadows. Yet one, filmed in 2003, recorded an audio anomaly, a low hum, pulsing like a heartbeat, audible only near the remains of the old ovens. Acoustic experts ruled out machinery. The nearest electrical grid was miles away. "It is the frequency of fermentation," one user joked. But others took it seriously, calling it the hum of hunger. Modern science, meanwhile, continued its uneasy courtship with the story. In 2007, a French toxicologist named Dr. Elodie Chenot conducted new tests on the bread fragments using advanced spectrographic imaging. Her findings, published quietly in a medical journal, reignited the controversy. Beneath layers of carbonization, she detected traces of Mandragora officinarum, mandrake root, another hallucinogenic herb associated with necromancy in medieval Europe. "It is improbable," she wrote, "that such an ingredient could have entered the food supply by accident." Her colleagues ridiculed her conclusion, yet none could explain the data. The church, too, resurfaced. In 2011, the Diocese of Lyon reopened its archival inquiry, citing persistent reports of spiritual unrest. A small team of theologians and exorcists was sent to perform a cleansing ritual at Montreval. The ceremony lasted 3 nights. On the final evening, one of the priests collapsed mid-prayer, claiming to hear a voice whispering in Latin, "Panis non meminit," bread does not forget. He never returned to the site. By now, the legend had transcended academia and entered the bloodstream of popular culture. Filmmakers, writers, and artists found endless inspiration in its contradictions. The story became everything: science fiction, gothic romance, psychological thriller. But at its core, the tension remained the same: belief versus reason, Guilt versus evidence, faith versus decay. Every explanation contradicted another, yet every witness insisted their version was true. In this friction, between proof and prayer, the Montreval mystery lives on. It is not a story that asks to be solved, but one that demands to be felt. The bread, whether poisoned or cursed, became more than sustenance. It became metaphor. It became mirror. It became the vessel through which generations projected their hunger for truth, for punishment, for meaning in suffering. And perhaps that is the final poison, that the tragedy feeds on our fascination, that each retelling becomes another loaf rising in the dark. Science dissects, faith consecrates, memory kneads, and the story endures, half-eaten, half-believed, endlessly rising. The aftermath of the Montreval tragedy did not end with the sealing of the chateau. It lingered like smoke in the valley, creeping into dreams, distorting generations. Survivors' families, servants, villagers, and distant cousins of the dead carried its weight in silence. Lucien Morel's lineage, marked forever by suspicion, suffered the worst of it. He was remembered as the man who may have killed a dynasty, or the man framed for an evil hen ever committed. Both possibilities were unbearable. Within a decade of the event, the Morel family name had vanished from Burgundy's parish books. By the time of the French Revolution, a branch had sailed to Canada, changing their name to Moray. They lived quietly, avoiding questions, never baking bread in their homes again. Across the ocean, they built new lives among strangers, yet the shadow followed. Diaries from the early 1800s, written by Lucien's grandson, André Moray, describe a recurring dream of a table covered in ash, where no one eats. He wrote of hearing his mother hum an unfamiliar tune while kneading dough, though she had sworn never to bake. Generations later, that same melody would be recognized by folklorists as a Burgundian mourning song, centuries old, believed to summon lost souls. Meanwhile, in France, the Montreval name dissolved. The estate's lands were parceled off during the Revolution, the family chapel razed, its relics sold. But the chateau itself remained untouched, shunned even by looters. Locals claimed that those who entered never slept soundly again. They spoke of dreams filled with the scent of yeast and the sound of grinding stone. When the property was finally auctioned in the 1830s, the buyer, a Parisian noble, died in his carriage en route to claim it. The sale was never completed. The deed passed from hand to hand, eventually lost in bureaucratic dust. By the 20th century, Montreval had become a ghost story. Travelers called it La Maison du Pain Maudit, the House of Cursed Bread. Children dared each other to approach its gates, their laughter breaking into nervous silence as they neared the crumbling walls. During World War II, German soldiers briefly occupied the site, using it as a storage outpost. Their reports mentioned strange happenings: rations spoiling overnight, radios emitting only static. One officer found in the kitchen at dawn, kneading dough with bare, bleeding hands. His commanding officer noted in the logbook. He said he was following orders. No one had given any. In 1973, a man named Philippe de Montreval arrived in Burgundy under the pretense of writing a family memoir. A descendant of the youngest surviving branch, he claimed he wanted to restore the family's reputation. Locals, weary of outsiders, avoided him. He spent his days in archives and his nights inside the chateau's ruins, where he set up camp despite warnings. Within 3 weeks, he was found dead in his hotel room in Dijon. On the bedside table sat a single loaf of bread, wrapped in linen. No fingerprints, no suicide note, only the faint scent of yeast clinging to the sheets. The autopsy revealed no toxins, no signs of struggle. His stomach was empty. The press dubbed it the Second Supper. In the decades that followed, the Montreval curse became fodder for every medium: books, radio dramas, televised investigations. Each retelling drew closer to obsession. Journalists approached the story as if it were an archaeological dig, unearthing fragments that refused to fit. In the early 2000s, a documentary crew from Paris ventured into the chateau, determined to film the truth behind the myth. Their footage was never aired. The surviving members of the crew described an atmosphere so thick it seemed to breathe. Their cameras malfunctioned the moment they entered the dining hall. Lenses fogged from within. Batteries drained inexplicably. One audio technician claimed he heard whispering in his headset, a woman's voice repeating the word "souviens-toi," remember. When he removed the headset, the whisper continued, faint but distinct, emanating from the ovens. He refused to return after that night. Another crew member, a sound engineer named Jules, provided a written statement months later. He described how during a late-night session, The temperature in the hall rose suddenly. The walls seemed to pulse like something alive, he wrote. A shadow appeared near the old ovens. Tall, stooped, shaped vaguely like a man wearing an apron. It did not move, yet the smell of baking bread filled the air. Jules fled before sunrise. He never spoke publicly again. Even skeptics left changed. One historian, a woman named Dr. Clémence Renaud, approached the story with nothing but science. She specialized in cultural pathology, arguing that the curse was merely a narrative constructed to rationalize a biological event. But after spending 3 nights cataloging the site, she resigned her position. Her last note in the field log read simply, "The air here is thick with memory." She never elaborated. To this day, the chateau remained closed to the public. Ownership is disputed. Restoration efforts have failed repeatedly. Architects who take on the project grow ill or lose funding. In 1992, a structural engineer reported that the foundation stonework was unnaturally warm, even during winter frost. Samples taken from the ovens showed no biological growth, no mold, no bacteria, yet emitted the faint aroma of burnt grain when exposed to air. For those who still live in the valley, the Montreval curse has become part of the landscape. They speak of it with the same caution reserved for bad weather or old wounds. Farmers refuse to sow rye within a mile of the chateau grounds. Bakers cross themselves before lighting their ovens. And every year on the anniversary of the tragedy, locals leave loaves of bread at the iron gate, an offering or perhaps an apology. The loaves are never taken, but be morning they are always gone. Children tell stories of the bread keeper, a ghostly figure who collects the offerings and returns them to the kitchen below. Some claim to have seen faint lights flickering in the windows at midnight. Others hear the rhythmic sound of kneading, slow, deliberate, like a heartbeat. None dare to stay long enough to see more. From a psychological perspective, the persistence of the legend is no mystery. The Montreval curse fulfills a deep human hunger for pattern and chaos. To believe that the bread was cursed is to impose moral order on catastrophe. If guilt brought ruin, then justice, however cruel, was served. If not, then the universe is indifferent, and the deaths at Montreval were nothing more than a chemical accident. Belief offers structure. Disbelief only despair. Yet even this reasoning cannot explain the anomalies that persist. In 2010, alchemist from Lyon analyzed a fragment of the original bread preserved at the Musée de Bourgogne. Using modern spectroscopy, he identified a compound resembling hyoscyamin, a toxic alkaloid found in nightshade, but also traces of myrrh, an embalming resin. The combination was unheard of in food preparation. The discovery reignited the debate. Was the bread intended as sustenance or sacrament? A meal or a ritual? Religious scholars took interest again. One Benedictine theologian proposed that the Montrevals, desperate to preserve their failing lineage, may have partaken in a secret rite, a parody of the Eucharist meant to secure eternal life. The substitution of holy ingredients, he argued, transformed blessing into curse. Others dismissed it as Gothic fantasy, yet the symbolism was undeniable. Bread as both body and death, nourishment and punishment intertwined. Philosophers found another meaning altogether. They saw in Montreval the reflection of human contradiction, the way love and cruelty coexist, how faith becomes hubris. The tragedy, they argued, was not supernatural but existential, the moment when civilization's civility cracks, revealing hunger for control beneath refinement. The bread did not just feed bodies, it fed illusions. Still, evidence continued to resist. Explanation. In 2015, thermal imaging during a new documentary shoot revealed a pattern of residual heat in the kitchen floor, consistent with an operational oven, but no fuel, flame, or source existed. The images, verified by independent technicians, remain inconclusive. One producer described the experience as standing inside a memory that refuses to cool. In recent years, interest in the Montreval legend has resurged online. Digital investigators, paranormal enthusiasts, and amateur historians trade theories on forums. Ergotism, ritual poisoning, mass hysteria, psychological contagion. Yet beneath the debates lies a single persistent detail. Thesmil. Nearly every visitor, skeptic or believer, reports catching the faint aroma of baking bread. Sweet, comforting, and wrong. For the descendants of Lucien Morel, now scattered across continents, the story has become both curse and identity. A Montreal journalist tracing her ancestry in 2021 discovered the connection accidentally. Her family, the Morays, had never spoken of France. When she visited Burgundy, locals refused to shake her hand once they learned her name's origin. That night, She claimed to dream of a man at an oven, his hands dusted in flour, his eyes filled with tears. He wasn't angry, she wrote in her article. He was tired. Whether the Montreval bread was poisoned, cursed, or simply rotten, it has transcended history. It now lives in the realm of psychological folklore, a reminder of how grief ferments into myth. Every retelling gives it new flavor, new texture. Scholars dissect it, artists romanticize it. But for those who live in Burgundy, the story remains painfully literal. When they walk past the chateau at dusk, they avert their eyes. They say the air tastes different there, thick, metallic, faintly sweet. Some nights when the mist settles low, the gates seem to breathe, and from deep within the ruins comes a sound, soft and persistent, the turning of dough beneath invisible hands. They leave their loaves not as offerings, but acknowledgments. Bread, after all, is the most human of creations, born of hunger, patience, and faith. It sustains, but it also reminds. It rises and falls. It remembers the warmth of the hands that made it. And perhaps that is the truest curse of Montreval, not a punishment from God or a crime of man, but the unbearable persistence of memory. For what is bread, if not the act of transformation? Grain crushed into dust, mixed with salt and tears, risen through fire. It is creation born from destruction, nourishment shaped by suffering. The villagers of Burgundy no longer speak the Montreval name aloud. Yet when storms roll through the valley and rain taps against shuttered windows, an old instinct returns. Mothers pull their children close. Bakers let their ovens cool early. And in the distance, from behind ivy-cloaked walls, a faint warmth rises once more, sweet, bitter, and eternal. Because even now, centuries later, the bread still feeds. Theories continue to multiply like mold on the last loaf of Montreval bread, thriving in darkness, feeding on uncertainty, impossible to contain. For every explanation offered, two more bloom in contradiction. Rationalists, mystics, historians, psychologists, each speaks with conviction, yet none can silence the others. The tragedy has become less a single event than an endless dialogue between fact and faith, proof and paranoia. The most enduring theory remains the simplest. Lucien Morel, the baker, poisoned the bread out of grief and rage. His daughter Celine's death, shrouded in vague accusations of theft and immorality, was said to have broken him. The narrative fits a familiar mold, a common man wronged by power, striking back in secret, crafting vengeance with his hands. Yet even this explanation frays upon inspection. Morel's surviving letters show no trace of malice. They reveal a man steeped in despair, yes, but not in hatred. His handwriting, steady, neat, records only silence where rage should be. "The oven cools without her voice," he wrote one winter morning, "and I cannot make it rise again." If grief alone drove him to murder, why was there no confession, no sign of revolt? And why did his body vanish from history as completely as the family's silverware? Some argue he fled, changing his name like his descendants would later do. Others insist he never left the chateau at all, that his remains were buried beneath the very ovens that birthed the cursed loaf. Excavations in the 1920s uncovered fragments of bone in the lower kitchen, but no record confirms whether they were human. The bones were taken to Dijon for analysis and never seen again. Another camp, smaller but no less fervent, insists that Lucien Morel was framed. According to this theory, the Montreval family themselves orchestrated the tragedy to conceal a greater scandal. Celine's dismissal and death were not accidents of class cruelty, but consequences of knowledge. Perhaps she discovered something she should not have. A secret ingredient, a forbidden practice. Letters unearthed in 1986 between Father Adrien, the priest who blessed the final meal, and an obscure Parisian occult scholar, lend chilling weight to this idea. The correspondence is cryptic, written in a mix of Latin and Old French, but one line stands out. They believe the bread will seal the soul to the bloodline forever. They knead pride into flesh. The implication is extraordinary, that the Montrevals were engaged in a ritual of alchemy or theology, attempting to immortalize their lineage by binding spirit to substance. The bread in this interpretation was no accident. It was sacrament misused. If true, the act bordered on heresy, even madness. Yet it fits the Montreval pattern. Vanity draped in ritual, sin disguised as sanctity. They had long prided themselves on their divine favor, commissioning frescoes that depicted their ancestors in halos, financing chapels where their names replaced those of saints. To them, faith was inheritance, immortality, and entitlement. Perhaps they truly believed they could make their devotion physical, eternal by consuming it. But if they sought to trap the soul within the flesh, something went terribly wrong. As the scholar to whom Father Adrian wrote replied in his final letter, "The elements do not obey pride. They remember intention, and so perhaps did the bread." Modern science, of course, offers more tangible explanations. Mycologists propose that the grain used for the meal was infected with Claviceps purpurea, ergot, a fungus known to cause hallucinations, convulsions, and death. These symptoms described by witnesses align almost perfectly with ergotism: blue lips, visions of fire, fits of madness. Similar outbreaks, such as the one in Pont Saint-Esprit in 1951, have proven the devastating effects of contaminated bread. But chemical tests on preserved fragments of the Montreval loaf tell a different story. No trace of ergot, no alkaloids. Instead, analysts found faint residues of hyoscyamin, an alkaloid from deadly nightshade, and traces of myrrh and frankincense, both used in funerary rites and embalming mixtures. These were not the ingredients of a mistake. They were the ingredients of a ritual. One toxicologist suggested contamination from old storage containers or proximity to mortuary herbs. But the explanation rang hollow. Deschâteau's blueprints deepened the mystery further. Beneath the bakery lies a sealed subcellar, accessible only by a narrow, bricked passage discovered in 1978. The chamber's walls are lined with lead, a metal historically used to contain both radiation and spirit in alchemical tradition. Inside, researchers found fragments of scorched parchment and a rusted chalice bearing the Montreval crest. No records explain its purpose. The subcellar does not appear in any estate documents before 1759, the year of the tragedy. What were they building beneath their kitchen? Some theorists suggest it was a hidden laboratory, part of an aristocratic obsession with early chemistry and life extension. France's Enlightenment-era elite were notorious for dabbling in the occult sciences. Alchemy dressed as philosophy, theology disguised as experiment. To turn bread into eternity may have been the ultimate act of fusion. The sacred and the scientific kneaded into one blasphemous ambition. Others reach even further. The strangest theories drift into realms beyond history's grasp. Some point to accounts of lights in the sky recorded by shepherds the night of the tragedy, an auroral display perhaps, or something stranger. In fringe circles, whispers of extraterrestrial interference persist. The idea that the family's experiments attracted not divine wrath but something cosmic. The lead-lined subcellar, they argue, was meant not to contain a ritual, but a shield against one. The theory borders on absurdity, yet its persistence says more about human nature than alien presence. When truth is unbearable, imagination becomes refuge. Among serious scholars, the debate narrows to two competing schools: contamination versus corruption. The contamination camp insists the tragedy was a product of environment: damp cellars, spoiled flour, primitive preservation. The corruption camp sees intent, a deliberate fusion of ritual and science, ambition turned inward until it devoured itself. Yet both sides agree on one thing: the event transcends explanation. No single theory satisfies the evidence. Every attempt to reduce the Montreval tragedy to chemistry or theology leaves something missing, an echo unaccounted for, a heat that refuses to dissipate. The ovens themselves remain a paradox. Despite centuries of disuse, they are remarkably intact. Their stones, blackened but unbroken, exude an inexplicable warmth even in the dead of winter. Scientists attribute it to geothermal seepage. Burgundy lies above subtle subterranean currents that can generate mild thermal anomalies. But locals shake their heads. Stones remember fire, they say, and fire remembers hunger. Perhaps both are right. Perhaps the warmth is natural, yet meaningfully so, a coincidence that mirrors myth too perfectly to dismiss. Because hunger, whether physical or moral, does not die easily. It bakes beneath history's crust, swelling in secret, waiting for the right fracture to rise again. The curse of Montreval, then, may not lie in the bread itself, but in what it represents. To bake is to transform, to take what is raw, grind it, mix it, expose it to flame. It is creation through destruction, nourishment through suffering. The Montrevals took that process and made it divine, or thought they did. They sought permanence in the impermanent, holiness in hunger. In doing so, they made themselves into their own offering. Psychologists studying the legend see it as an allegory of guilt and repression. Generations of oppression, the aristocracy feeding upon the poor, culminated in an act of symbolic inversion. The masters ate their own doom. The villagers' retellings, they argue, were not superstition but catharsis, a way for collective trauma to ferment into story. Myth became moral order. It gave meaning to suffering. And yet something resists even that tidy interpretation. Every generation that revisits the Montreval case emerges changed, haunted not by what is proven, but by what remains unsolved. The legend regenerates itself like a living culture, feeding on curiosity. Each new documentary, each new investigation keeps it warm. The curse endures precisely because it refuses to close. Like dough, it rises when pressed down, reshaping itself around every attempt to contain it. In the end, perhaps that is its truest nature. Not a haunting, but a hunger. A hunger for answers, for absolution, for the impossible reconciliation of reason and mystery. For centuries, pilgrims of curiosity have come to the chateau, historians, thrill-seekers, scientists, and all have left with the same uneasy feeling, that something beneath those stones still breathes. Tourists who peer into the ovens describe not just warmth, but pulse. A rhythm beneath the surface, faint yet steady, as if the stones themselves are alive. They laugh it off in daylight, but when night falls and the wind carries the faint scent of yeast, laughter turns to unease. One visitor, a geologist from Lyon, described the experience in her notes. It is not the heat that frightens, it is the patience of it, the sense that it is waiting. Waiting for what? For faith to return? For vengeance to complete its circle? For memory to cool? Maybe none of those. Maybe all. Because history, like dough, can never be unmade. Once mixed, flour, salt, grief, it must rise or rot. The Montreval tragedy is not a story that ends. It is a process that continues. A fermentation of myth, guilt, and fascination that refuses to go stale. When modern visitors walk the ruined halls, they find etchings in the soot, names, prayers, recipes. One, carved near the kitchen door, reads, Pain béni, pain maudite. Blessed bread, cursed bread. Two halves of the same truth. Perhaps that is what the Montreval story has always been, a parable of duality. Nourishment and destruction, faith and folly, memory and decay, all bound in the same loaf. And as long as there are those who hunger for meaning, the ovens will never truly cool. Theories will continue to multiply, feeding upon the warmth of curiosity. Scientists will test the stones, mystics will bless them, storytellers will shape them anew. The Château de Montreval will remain what it has always been, a place where truth is baked too deeply into myth to ever be separated again. Even today, if you stand by the crumbling gate at dusk, you might feel a faint heat rising from the earth. You might catch the scent, warm crust, faint sweetness, a trace of ash. You might think it memory. You might think it madness. But whatever it is still alive. The Château de Montreval is gone now, reclaimed by ivy, silence, and centuries of forgetting. Its marble hall shave caved in, its gardens overtaken by wild thorns, and its dining room, once a cathedral of indulgence, lies beneath a shallow pool of rainwater and moss. Only the ovens remain, blackened and half-buried, their stone mouths gaping toward the sky like open graves. The dynasty that once commanded half of Burgundy has dissolved into myth, its portraits rotted, its crest unrecognizable. Yet when storms roll across the valley, villagers claim the rain tastes faintly of yeast. It clings to the air, warm, bitter, and almost human, as though the land itself still exhales the memory of that final supper. Some dismiss the stories as coincidence, the residue of imagination on weathered tongues. Others say it is a kind of remembrance, the soil mourning those who fed upon it, or the bread reclaiming what was once taken. The legend has grown porous, shaped by every era that retells it. Rationalists speak of toxins and hysteria. Poets call it divine irony, the faithful whisper that Montreval fell not to poison, but to pride. And yet, none can explain why the story refuses to die, why it resurfaces every generation like a seed that cannot rot. Perhaps the bread was poisoned by accident, perhaps by grief, perhaps it was never poisoned at all, but remembered that way by a conscience too heavy to bear. It may be that guilt needs its myths as much as hunger needs its bread, to make sense of what cannot be forgiven. The peasants spoke of a servant's curse. The nobles blamed the soil. In truth, both might have been right. Grief and guilt ferment the same way, unseen, unstoppable, and always rising. Even now, scholars pick apart the fragments, a line in Alliger, a bloodstain on a floorboard, a loaf petrified in glass. They debate whether ergot or evil took the family, whether Lucien Morel was victim or accomplice, whether the curse was spiritual or psychological. But the more they examine, the less they find. The evidence contradicts itself, as though the event resists dissection, as though the bread remembers but refuses to tell. Today, the land where the chateau once stood is a vineyard. Tourists come for the wine, not knowing that the grapes grow where the ovens once smoked. The locals do not correct them. Sometimes, at harvest, the scent of baking drifts inexplicably through the vines. Workers pause, look toward the hills, and say nothing. They know better than to speak the name aloud. Historians still argue, scientists still test, priests still pray, but none can explain why the tale endures. Maybe because it speaks to something ancient within us, the knowledge that what we create with love can destroy us just as easily. The last surviving record attributed to Lucien Morel holds only one trembling line: bread is life, but life, when bitter, feeds death. So the ovens remain cold, the rain still carries the taste of yeast, and the story, like hunger, never ends. What do you believe?